to have the chance to start tonight with some good news on the pandemic front. Millions of teenagers are going to be able to get a booster soon. But I hate to tell you, we got to follow that news with this. The COVID winter surge getting so bad, some states are calling in troops. We're live with what you should know. Plus, President Biden walking a diplomatic tightrope right now. We've got new details about what Ukraine's president just told him as the White House tries to pull Russia back from the brink of war. And breaking right as we're coming on the air, I mean it, right as we're walking into the studio, a big blow to former President Donald Trump in his push to try and keep January 6th related documents secret. The brand new ruling from the appeals court and where this is headed next. And former reality star Josh Duggar convicted on child porn charges, what he faces at his sentencing, and how the attorney who led the case is responding tonight. Plus, the exclusive backstory on one of the country's first ever overdose prevention centers. Our Jacob Soboroff tells us what it was like to go in this safe space where people can use illegal drugs with help nearby if they need it. Plus, New Zealand's new law to try and ban younger people from buying cigarettes forever. It is innovative, it is controversial, and it's got a pretty big caveat. We got more on that a little bit later. Hey, I'm Hallie, and we're getting it going tonight with that big announcement in the fight against COVID. Just a few weeks out from the Christmas holidays and in the middle of this winter surge. Turns out it's now safe for millions of 16 and 17-year-olds to get the Pfizer vaccine booster. That emergency authorization came in from the FDA this afternoon, with the CDC director given the final green light just within the last couple hours. So it means those older teens can now get the shot 6 months after their second dose of Pfizer. That's not the case, at least not yet, for Moderna and J&J, but TBD on that. So that's the good news. And here is the not so good news. More people keep getting infected with COVID. So much so right now that 3 states up north, New York, New Hampshire, Maine, are calling in the National Guard to help. And in Wisconsin, the governor there is already tapped out of National Guard resources. He's using those nurses to backstop staff shortages at mental health facilities. So now he's asking the White House to send 100 federal health care workers to help instead. I want to bring in our Antonia Hilton live in Connecticut, which is seeing a 60% uptick in cases, even though it's one of the most vaccinated states. So, Antonia, let me talk through kind of all these headlines here. And let's start with that booster news for 16 and 17-year-olds, because in just the last week, kids under 18 were about 22% of COVID cases across the country. This means now some of those older teens can have access to boosters. What have you heard about this from doctors, from folks that you've talked to?
Well, folks here are receiving that news really well. The CEO of Pfizer just a little while ago released a statement calling this a critical milestone. And I would say doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals here are reacting with a similar position on this. Look, the booster aspect of this next stage of the war, both on the continued infections from Delta and now the Omicron variant, of which there are 2 confirmed cases here. That is really a key central part of how Connecticut sort of sees its moving forward strategy. And that's because, as you said, this is a state that has been ahead of the game for most of the pandemic. Many of the people here were first in line to get vaccinated. So that also means many of the people here have waning immunity now. And they're really trying to get through to those folks to say, if you were vaccinated now many, many months ago, you're not as protected as you once were, especially with this new looming threat from Omicron. And you need to come out to sites like this one here at Scalzi Park, public, free healthcare centers, and get your booster shots, Hallie.
You've got those states we talked about, not too far from Connecticut, right? Some of them in New England that are bringing in the National Guard. How are they going to be helping, right? Talk through what that actually looks like.
So what this really is going to look like is, so first, Maine and New York have called on the National Guard to come in to various medical facilities. New York is specifically going to ask them to go to long-term care facilities. And then New Hampshire is also calling on them, but they're also calling on FEMA. And, to make sense of this for folks, this doesn't mean that National Guard is going to come in and start doing surgeries or procedures. This is the kind of administrative and support work. I mean, some of them are going to be working on things like food for staff and patients at these facilities, the kind of work that starts to fall by the wayside. You see a lot of pressure and attention when healthcare staff ends up really strained in the midst of these winter surges. And that's what those states are anticipating, and that's what the state of Connecticut is right now trying to avoid.
Right. And they're looking at this probably because this post-Thanksgiving surge we were all warned about, it seems.
Oh, yeah, and it's the Thanksgiving surge here in Connecticut, and it's also a helpful reminder of the continued threat posed by Delta, because, here we're seeing 575 people currently hospitalized. That's more than 3 times what we were seeing here just a couple weeks ago, and that's being driven by Delta. And, look, that's again why there's this push for the booster element here in the community, because many of those cases, about 76, 77% of them are unvaccinated folks who healthcare workers still want to reach. But there's an increasing number of breakthrough cases there. And I talked through all of this with the mayor of Stamford. Take a listen to what she had to say.
Unfortunately, as we saw over the holidays, we saw a lot of people gathering indoors together without masks, and we know that that leads to transmission.
The city is also collaborating with statewide leaders like the governor on a new Excelsior-style pass, a vaccine passport similar to the one that we have in New York. And the hope with that is that it's going to help employers or people running venues to really check and make sure, are the employees who work for them, are the folks who are coming in as guests actually vaccinated or not, and then take the steps to make sure that they're keeping people safe over these next critical months, Hallie.
Antonia Hilton, live for us there in Connecticut. Antonia, thank you. Right now, back here in Washington, President Biden's trying to work some diplomatic magic, right? Can he figure out a solution to this military stare down between Russia and Ukraine? And will that solution mean big punishment for Russia? The president just got the other side of the story after getting Putin's take earlier this week. This is him on a call just this afternoon, just finished up with Ukraine's President Zelensky. Lasted a little over an hour. Just to give you the behind the scenes look, the photographers here are standing on the colonnade by the Rose Garden outside the Oval Office, shooting in through a window to get this shot of the president on the phone. So what was he saying? What were they talking about? We only know Ukraine's version of events, at least right now, but they're saying the president is standing by the country's commitment to staying independent from Russia. Now, will Putin invade? Won't he? We don't know. The president's threatening big economic sanctions if he does. And right now, here's where U.S. intelligence thinks the Kremlin's building up troops. I want to show you this map here. You can see it. Multiple places right along the border. About 70,000 Russian troops waiting. It's expected that could grow to maybe 175,000. I want to bring in NBC's Mike Memoli, who's over at the White House with more for us tonight. Mike, real quick, no update yet from the White House on like the U.S. side of that U.S.-Ukraine call?
No, literally just a few minutes ago, the president was asked, he was holding a meeting with his COVID response team. A reporter asked him if he could offer any perspective on what happened in that phone call. He did not answer the question. We are expecting a little bit of a debrief from the national security team later this hour. So that'll be, we expect our first opportunity to hear from what the U.S. says about what has been a very high stakes couple of calls over the last few days.
And listen, when we say high stakes, like that's a term that I think gets thrown around a bunch. Like I know everything's high stakes in D.C., but like this really is complicated, right? This is complicated diplomacy. The U.S. doesn't even have an ambassador in Kiev, right? Mm-hmm. How does the president sort this out? Because the last thing he wants to do is provoke Russia. He also wants to send a message.
Well, it's a very volatile situation. Anytime you see the kind of force numbers that Russia has amassed on multiple borders of Ukraine, you really can't underestimate what that moment could end up being. And that's why the White House is treading very carefully. But so far, the choreography that they've laid out this week, the call with President Putin, a day to brief some of our European allies, today the call with Zelensky and some of the other neighbors in Eastern Europe who have a lot to worry about what's happening to their east and to the south. It's really played out largely as expected, and that's a good thing from the White House perspective. Now, they're preparing, White House officials tell us, for every worst-case scenario, of course, what would happen if Russian troops move over the border. But there's also a sense in the White House that, Putin is potentially bluffing here. And so they're being very mindful in trying to calibrate their response so not to over-escalate here, especially if what Putin really is getting already what he wants, which is a lot of attention.
Well, and I have to think, if Vladimir Putin hears that the White House thinks he's bluffing, it's very likely, right? I mean, there's a very good chance that tips the balance there in a way that the White House doesn't want to see. Do you think that, as we talk about Ukraine and President Zelensky there, do you think he heard what he needed to as far as the commitments from President Biden as it relates to their sovereignty?
There was one very big issue that needed to be cleared up today because there had been some reporting, at least indications that perhaps when President Biden spoke with President Putin, he expressed a willingness to have a conversation about some of the sort of Russian separatist parts of Ukraine and whether those borders might be negotiable. The White House, literally at the White House and at the State Department, has done everything they can to clear that up, say absolutely no, we are affirming our support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. And that was a message we expect the president was delivering directly to President Zelensky today. But there are some larger and thornier questions about, for instance, Ukraine's potential membership in NATO. That's been the red line that President Putin has established. He wants to see that ruled out in a legal form. The White House is not willing to do that, even though, let's be honest, Ukraine is probably at least a decade away from going through all the steps that are needed needed in order to become a NATO ally. But this is obviously a moment when Ukraine is literally being pulled in both directions. There's been, for decades, trying to move closer to the West, but Ukraine doing everything, Russia doing everything it can to try to keep its hold on it toward the east.
Mike Memole, smart analysis, great reporting. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Mike. As always, appreciate it, ma'am. So if you are President Trump, the former president, and if you are happening to be watching NBC News now, right now, this program, you are probably not happy with the news we're about to deliver, because it turns out a federal appeals court is delivering a blow to Donald Trump's efforts to try to keep a whole bunch of January 6th related documents secret from the congressional committee investigating the Capitol riot. You remember there was this back and forth we talked about a whole lot last month. It was kind of a ping pong, right, between the federal judge and Mr. Trump's attorneys. You had the judge that rejected a request from the attorneys to block this document release. It's coming from the National Archives. The attorneys then came back, re-asked for the block. The judge said no again. You know, back and forth, back and forth. Here's what matters. The ruling that just came down within the last 40 minutes. Here to break it down is Pete Williams. Pete, let me just turn it over to you. Explain to us what the appeals court is saying and what this means.
So just to continue your ping pong ball analogy, what happened is the president lost in the lower court, an appeal to the D.C. Court of Appeals, and the case was heard by a 3-judge panel, which has just put out this 68-page opinion.
This is it?
This is it.
Look at you bringing it to set.
It's unanimous. What the court says basically is, yes, the former president does have some residual executive privilege, but any privilege is always a balancing test. And in this case, here's his privilege, and it is outweighed by the congressional need for these documents. So the problem for the president, the appeals court says, is for President Trump, is the current president, President Biden, has decided not to assert executive privilege. Congress has shown a need for these documents. They're relevant to what the committee is looking into. There's no alternative source for them. And Mr. Trump can't show how he himself would be harmed if these were turned over. Remember, the Trump claim was, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for the country because it would be bad for presidents to be able to get confidential advice from their aides.
To protect future precedent, basically.
Correct. That was his argument. And the court says that has to give way to the need here that Congress has for these documents. Now, there's always a little music in one of these federal court rulings, and so let me just quote you the closing paragraph.
Please do.
This is written by Judge Patricia Millett for the 3-judge panel. She says, quote, Benjamin Franklin said at the founding, we have a republic if we can keep it. The events of January 6th exposed the fragility of these democratic institutions and traditions that we had perhaps come to take for granted. In response, the President of the United States and Congress have each made the judgment that access to this subset of presidential communications records is necessary to address a matter of great constitutional moment for the Republic. Now, one other note here, Hallie. Under this order, archives now must turn the documents over.
Right.
But the appeals court has called a timeout, put a stay on its own order of 14 days, giving Mr. Trump's lawyers 2 weeks now to go to the Supreme Court. Why do I say the Supreme Court? Because they could go to the full Court of Appeals, but his lawyers themselves made it pretty clear when this case was argued that their next step would be to the Supreme Court.
Bottom line of all of it is, it appears as though the former president is almost out of options, right? Unless one left to keep these documents secret, right?
Correct.
So the what's next step is the Supreme Court. Before we, and I say we, the congressional committee investigating, right, the riot gets to see these documents.
Right.
You know the court. You've covered the court for many years. Is this something they'd take up? Well,
on the one hand, you know, the court doesn't have to take this. Right. It could just say, yeah, we've read the Court of Appeals, looks right to us, never mind.
And if that happens, this stays in place.
Then the stay dissolves.
Then it has to go.
And archives and Trump loses, game over. If the court says, okay, we will take a look at this, and why would they? Well, they might because it's a big deal. And it's the first time we've ever had this question of how much residual authority does a former president have. So they might say that they want to take a crack at this. I can't predict what they would do, nor can I predict how quickly they would act.
Right.
I mean, if you assume that one of the things that the Trump lawyers probably would like to do is drag this out as long as possible, you know, under normal circumstances, if they go to the Supreme Court right now, I don't think this case would be argued this term because the exchange of briefs couldn't happen until probably late January. It's too late to get it on the calendar for this term. But I think that they might expedite it and the Supreme Court would certainly know that it's moved on a very fast track in both the district court here and the Court of Appeals.
And the reason the timeline matters is because there is some speculation that, by the time you get to the midterms, if Democrats don't maintain control of the House, this select committee goes away. Really quickly, Pete, 2 more quick questions. Give me the why it matters, right? For people who aren't following, like you and I live in Washington, we cover this every day. If you're not, why is this significant?
Well, I think it matters for historic reasons and reasons of how this country works. When Congress wants something like this from the former president, who gets to decide? Who gets it? Yeah. So it matters from that perspective. And if the committee is correct here, then there's information that it can't get from any other source. If you want a thorough investigation, you need as much as you can get.
Can you share what you wrote in the margins in your notes that I can see there?
Certainly.
Okay, we'll talk about it off camera.
Okay.
Very good. Pete Williams, our justice correspondent. Thank you, Pete. I know it's been a busy afternoon for you. Appreciate it.
You bet.
First lawsuits have been filed in that Michigan school shooting that happened not too long ago. The parents of 2 of the girls hurt in the attack are suing the school district for $200 million. One of the daughters was shot in the neck in front of her sister during that shooting. Both girls survived, but parents are blaming the school. They say they failed to stop it, which is why they're suing the district, the superintendent, the principal, and others. You'll remember that these 4 teenagers, Hannah St. Juliana, Tate Meyer, Madison Baldwin, Justin Schilling, were all killed at Oxford High School. And the prosecutor revealed there were concerns about the suspected shooter's behavior both the day before and the morning of the shooting. The district has not yet responded to that lawsuit. You might remember him as the oldest kid on the reality show 19 Kids and Counting, Josh Duggar. That's the same Josh Duggar who was convicted today on child pornography charges. We just got this video in. Take a look. It shows Duggar. Well, that's Emily Ikeda. That is not that video. Duggar was booked into Washington County Jail this afternoon. Emily Ikeda is covering all of this for us. Emily, we know that Duggar faces up to 20 years in prison. He faces fines of something like $250,000 on each of these 2 counts of downloading these images. Tell us more about the case, the conviction, and what happens next.
Hey there, Hallie. Okay, so for background, in 2006, Duggar was investigated, but he was never charged as a result of statute of limitations. But those earlier allegations were referenced. They resurfaced in this year's federal case. A family friend testifying that Duggar confessed to molesting several girls in 2003. She told the court, quote, "You don't forget something like that," according to our local affiliate. The jury delivering the guilty verdict today after just 1 day of deliberations. As you mentioned, he was found guilty of both downloading and possessing child pornography. And really, the prosecutors calling the result a milestone in their fight to end and against child abuse. Something else I will mention, this highly watched federal court case is all playing out as Josh Duggar's father, Jim Bob, is making a run for state senate. He's previously, Hallie, served in the Arkansas House of Representatives.
Any responses? You talk about the Duggar family from them, from the attorneys. What's next here?
Okay, so Duggar's defense is promising to appeal the result after failing to convince jurors that it was someone else to upload the images to his computers, including some really explicit child abuse images. One investigator calling it the worst of the worst that he's ever examined. As for the sentencing, that is expected to happen in the next several months or so. Again, that for each count, he could face up to 20 years in prison and a $250,000 fine.
Emily,
Hallie,
thank you so much. Appreciate that reporting. Coming up here on the show, more gut-wrenching testimony today in the trial of Kim Potter. We heard today from the woman who was in the passenger seat when Daunte Wright was shot. She's now sharing the details of what she saw that day. It is tough to watch. Ron Allen is in Minneapolis with that story for us. And we are now hearing from Travis Scott in his first interview since that Astroworld concert that killed 10 fans. The rapper insists he had no clue it was actually going down. We've got more on what he said. You'll hear from him, plus the lawsuits he's facing next. A key witness, and again, another day of just gut-wrenching testimony in the Kim Potter trial. She is the ex-Minnesota police officer charged with manslaughter in the death of Daunte Wright. Elena Albrecht Payton had just started dating Wright, I should say. This is her testimony. You can already see she's crying. She can barely talk through her tears because she's describing she was in the passenger seat of Wright's car when he was shot and killed. And she's testifying about what led up to that shooting and how she tried to stop the bleeding from what happened when Kim Potter used her gun to shoot Wright. Potter has said she thought she was pulling her taser. Here it is.
I just put my hands over his chest and I just tried to hold it, and I was just trying to scream his name. And I was just trying to have him talk to me, and just kept saying, Dante, like, just say something, please, like, just talk to me. And he just couldn't. Like, I know he tried, like, I know he wanted to.
Again, she can barely talk. She's so upset. Jurors were also looking at some of this video that you're seeing right now. This is dash cam video. And if we are able to take another look and maybe drop that banner, you can see Wright's car crashing into another car right there. Testimony today from an officer on the scene says it took 5 to 10 minutes for somebody to approach that car and give help to Wright. I want to bring in now Ron Allen in Minneapolis. Ron, you've been covering this trial for us, and let me start with that emotional testimony. Yet again here, jurors in the room are hearing from somebody close to Dante Wright who could, who's even having trouble testifying because this is so emotional for them. And she's kind of a key witness here, no? Because she was in the car when he was shot.
She was sitting in the passenger seat, and if you can imagine what that's like to be sitting next to someone, it's the middle of the day, or you think you're driving to a car wash with a friend, and all of a sudden there's this traffic stop, and then it starts to escalate, and then there's a gunshot that goes off, killing Dante Wright, shot right through the chest. And she is, the other element of all that is that Wright calls his mother, and the mother tries to call back when he has to hang up the phone. And when Dante Wright's mother calls back, she gets his girlfriend on the phone. It's a FaceTime connection, and the young woman points the phone at Dante Wright's body to show his mother via FaceTime what had just happened. And it's just a horrific set of circumstances, regardless of anything else that's happening here. Just to focus on that it's been really very powerful. Now, whether all that leads to the conviction of former Officer Potter for manslaughter or not, of course, remains to be seen. But the jury has been hearing some very, very emotional testimony about what happened.
Do they seem at all like they're listening intently to this, Ron? I would think. Is there any reaction from them that anybody's picked up inside the courtroom?
It's really hard to tell because it is a pool situation. We're not allowed in the courtroom to see the jury. We get reports, and obviously I would think that any human being sitting this close to a grieving mother and a distraught friend of someone who's 20 years old is going to be affected by that. And that, of course, is part of what I think the prosecutors want to have happen. They want the jury to feel what happened, to understand what happened, and to really humanize this individual. And that's what all of that is about. But you're right, in the case of his girlfriend, she is a witness. She also described how when the officer approached him, when the whole situation started, he was more nervous than ever, than she'd ever seen him. And a big issue is when he got back in the car, did he try to drive away? She says that he didn't, and so on and so forth. So she is also a witness in terms of the interaction between Dante Wright and the officers. That makes her testimony also very important, along with just the humanity that she, and then the emotion that she exudes to the jury.
And then, Ron, really quickly here, just because we've been showing this video of that crash, right, and the testimony today, I know, revolved around the fact that it took officers a couple of minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, I think was the testimony, to actually get there. There was some confusion about what was happening to get there and deliver help, deliver aid to Wright and to the passenger we're talking about, Elena. Can you explain why that's significant?
Because the prosecutors are saying that Officer Potter also failed in this regard in the aftermath of what happened, that she didn't render aid, that she didn't call for assistance, that she didn't tell other officers what had happened. So when they get to the scene of this car crash, they have no idea what's happened. And that's why they say they approached the car so carefully, because they think there might have been a gun. The initial report was about a shooting, but no one told them that it was an officer-involved shooting, which might have changed the calculus somewhat. And again, prosecutors are arguing that this is another way in which Kim Potter failed in her duty and is guilty because they're essentially insinuating that she tried to cover this up, or that the officers didn't respond as they would have had it been another kind of situation not involving one of their own. So that's what they're essentially, I think, trying to put in the juror's mind, because the whole case is about Potter failing betraying her badge, failing in her duty, and failing Daunte Wright.
Ron Allen, live for us there, covering all of it. Ron, thank you so much. Appreciate that. So you know rapper Travis Scott, he's now out doing his first interview since 10 people died at his Astro World concert last month. Scott kept playing for more than half an hour after police were responding to emergency calls. Well, now, today, he's telling Charlamagne the God he didn't know how bad things were while he was on stage.
I didn't know the exact details until, minutes before the press conference.
Mm-hmm.
And even at that moment, you kind of just like, wait, what?
An attorney representing dozens of victims, including Axel Acosta, who died that night, say that Travis Scott is not the victim. I'm quoting here. They say Travis Scott and basically everybody around him is the problem. Danny Savalos is here to talk about all this. Danny, Charlamagne asked Scott why he was doing an interview now, and Scott says it's because he needed a way to communicate. Here's more of what he said.
It really, it hurts. It hurts the community. It hurts a city. And it's just been a lot of thoughts, a lot of feelings, a lot of grieving, and just, trying to wrap my head around it,
You heard from that attorney that they feel like Travis Scott is trying to play the victim here. And they're saying that's way off base, right? We know that the offer from Scott to pay for some of the funerals for the victims was turned down by several families. Can you talk about, as an attorney, the optics here for Scott to be doing this?
Bad. I mean, attorneys are risk averse, so our approach is always going to be generally.
You say that a lot, Danny, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, our approach, we don't want the client to talk if we can help it, especially a client that has potential civil and even possibly criminal exposure. But sometimes a defense team or a legal team makes the decision that you have to get out in front of a story if there's been too much negative press out there. But you have to balance that against the probability that your client, no matter how much you prepare him, will get up there and totally fumble the ball in an interview. And that happens more often than you may think. On the whole, that's possibly exactly what happened here.
Do you think that Travis Scott fumbled the ball in this, Danny? To use your terminology?
Yeah, I do, because he succeeded in expressing sympathy and saying a lot, but not actually committing to anything. There were a lot of niceties like want to figure out what's going on and fix the problem and things that don't really commit to anything. And in that way, what he said was probably good because it said nothing. But on the other hand, there's a very substantial chance that people will interpret him as being insensitive or really self-concerned more than concerned about the people who lost their lives and were injured.
You also heard him talking about how, repeating now for the first time on camera, right? We hear from him. We've seen this in statements saying, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't see what was happening in front of me. He's somebody who's known for this, raging at concerts, right? Crowds just going off. Do you think it was at all helpful for him to at least be seen and heard saying what he said in statements, which is, I didn't know how bad it was while I was on stage performing?
Yes, it was important for him to get that message out there that in real time, I was not aware of what was going on. That is actually a separate and distinct concept than, generally speaking, were you aware that this kind of chaos went on at your concerts? To which there is some evidence in the past, including criminal evidence, that he was aware that people raged at his concerts, that there was a crush toward the stage. But ultimately, it was important. I'm sure his legal team was very happy that he got the message out that as this was happening, I was not aware. Whether or not law enforcement and plaintiffs' attorneys believe him, that's another topic.
Danny Savalos, as always, thank you. Tonight, tributes are still coming in for Bob Dole as he was honored on Capitol Hill today. President Biden calling the late senator an American giant. We've got more on how others are remembering him. Plus, more legal trouble for former President Trump, different than the legal trouble we just talked about a couple of minutes ago. This coming from New York's Attorney General, who wants to depose him in a civil fraud investigation. We're going to tell you what that's about coming up. Some serious change brewing at Starbucks. Do you get it? Brewing because Starbucks brews coffee? The workers are voting for the company's first ever labor union. This is a big deal union vote in Buffalo, New York. It actually has repercussions even here in Washington. Dasha Burns has more on that. But first, let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number one, war hero and former Senate leader Bob Dole lying in state at the Capitol Rotunda today. He died Sunday at the age of 98. Dole is only the 33rd person in U.S. history to lie in state in the Rotunda. This was the emotional scene. Incredibly emotional for so many people. You can see the president, the first lady there, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, many other lawmakers, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer right there paying their respects. Number 2, an explosion in central Mali Wednesday killed 7 UN peacekeepers and seriously hurt 3 others. The UN says this logistics convoy hit a roadside bomb at a place where terrorist groups are known to operate. So far, no particular group has claimed responsibility for this attack. Number 3, California's Attorney General is investigating the Torrance Police Department, that's right near L.A., over what he's calling deeply concerning allegations. Why? The LA Times just reported that several officers were allegedly sending each other racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic texts and photos. Number 4, the Prime Minister of Finland. Have you heard about this one, Sanna Marin? She's apologizing after a photo popped up of her in a club after she got COVID. She was exposed to COVID, rather. Marin is vaccinated. She said she knows she did wrong and that she should have considered the issue more carefully. Number 5, 11 million people woke up under winter weather alerts this morning in the central and western parts of the U.S. You got some regions getting ready for 12 inches of snow or more, a foot of snow just a few weeks before Christmas. The National Weather Service says this storm is going to carry into Friday. Could get in the way of weekend travel plans. For the first time ever, a Starbucks store has voted to unionize. It's one in Buffalo, and it's the first company-owned U.S. store to organize successfully. 2 other stores also voted. It was a split decision there. The vote was one opposed the union, and for a third store, a final decision has been delayed because of challenge votes. We're going to have to see what the impact is around the country. I want to get to Dasha Burns. She's been following this story. Dasha, okay, so let me get big picture here, right? Why this matters, rather. A lot of people had been watching this effort to organize. Starbucks, faced these union challenges in New York and Philly before those got shut down. This did not in Buffalo.
Yeah, and Buffalo, New York, Hallie, kind of an unlikely place to become a new epicenter for the labor movement, right? And kind of an unlikely group leading it. This was led by Gen Z and millennial baristas who wanted a seat at the corporate table. They went through the pandemic. They thought, hey, we want to have our voices heard by these executives who have made so much money off of our labor during this really difficult time. And so what we saw today was frankly pretty historic and groundbreaking. The first ever Starbucks unionized corporate-owned Starbucks store in the United States in Buffalo. So one of those 3 stores voted yes. The other, as you mentioned, voted no, though there was some debate there. The union lawyer saying that some of the votes weren't counted. So we might see some legal challenges there. And then we're still waiting for the final say in the third store with those challenged votes. But we have one, and that says a lot, and that's setting up some precedent here, Hallie.
And this is something that got a ton of attention, right? We heard from Senator Bernie Sanders about this. We heard from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Do you see, there may be a bigger impact here for other companies in the service industry, possibly?
Well, look, this movement started because another coffee chain in Buffalo, Spock Coffee, unionized successfully. They saw their wages go up. They saw better benefits. And this happened a couple of years ago. And so the Starbucks workers saw that and thought, hey, maybe we could do this, too. And it's interesting, Hallie, because the service sector is not an industry that has a long history with unions. We talked to one longtime union organizer who's worked for the UAW, AFL-CIO, and he says what these young baristas are doing for the service industry is kind of akin to what their grandparents and great-grandparents did for manufacturing back in the 30s and 40s. And, of course, that left a long legacy, Hallie.
Dasha Burns, live for us there, covering all of it. Dasha, thank you.
Thanks.
So we've already told you about some of former President Trump's legal troubles earlier in the show. We have more to tell you about now. If you ask him, it's another partisan witch hunt. If you ask the state of New York, it's a major part of their investigation into alleged tax fraud at his company. New York's Attorney General Letitia James wants former President Trump to appear under oath for a deposition next month. She's thinking about whether to file a civil suit against the Trump organization. She also, we should mention, by the way, just dropped out of the New York governor's race. And while the cases sometimes change, right, the response remains the same from the former president's legal team. We've seen this from him related to other investigations he's faced before, slamming them, and his attorney doing the same, calling them as purely political deposition requests, and that they'll wait to see what's in the subpoenas before responding more fulsomely. Ken Delanian is here with us live. Ken, it's good to see you. Thank you for breaking this down for us here. And I got to be clear here, because I think people hear, oh, New York investigating Donald Trump. They think about maybe that criminal investigation against him being run by the Manhattan District Attorney. Right. This is different.
Yeah, that's one of the complexities here, though. The Manhattan District Attorney has indicted, right, the Trump Organization and the CFO, Alan Weisselberg, on these tax fraud charges, accusing them of a scheme of trying to evade taxes. There's a parallel civil investigation going on by the New York Attorney General. But she's also part of the criminal probe. And for that reason, Donald Trump's lawyer has told my colleague Jonathan Dienst from WNBC that they're going to try to quash this subpoena. They think it's improper. She can't run a criminal investigation, but then try to backdoor a civil interview. But even if that doesn't work, you can imagine that he's going to take the Fifth Amendment, because it would be crazy. You heard Danny Savalas say in the last segment, lawyers don't like their clients.
Risk averse. Danny, that's like Danny's favorite phrase. You know, exactly. Lawyers are risk averse. But explain that, right? Because the interesting thing about a deposition is if the client does answer, right, or if the person you're deposing does answer, you don't know what doors crack open, right? You don't know what answers lead to something else that could be useful down the road. But he can go and plead the Fifth?
Yeah, he could avoid, I mean, absolutely has, because he is in criminal jeopardy in this other investigation. And there's the other factor is, you know, he is a notoriously terrible deposition witness. He's been sued thousands of times in his career, and journalists who have poured over his deposition say that he's often unprepared, and he often has a distant relationship from the truth, to put it mildly. So it would be really dangerous for him to do this.
Can you give us the sort of big picture look at the various sort of investigations and legal challenges facing President Trump right now? Because he sat for a deposition, I think it was 2 months ago, October maybe, right? Yep. About an alleged assault at Trump Towers a few years back. There's these 10 civil cases at least pending against him, right? It's
a dizzying array. I had to go look it all up. I mean, there's, his sister Mary Trump is suing him, alleging he defrauded her of her inheritance, millions of dollars, right? He's being sued for defamation by a woman who has accused him of rape. The Trump Organization is being sued, accused of scamming investors in a business scheme. And there's that D.C. civil suit accusing them of misusing inaugural funds to benefit the Trump Organization. And that's only a partial list, Hallie. So there's a lot of this that's going to be going on for many years.
Ken Delanian, thank you for breaking that down. Good to see you. Appreciate it. Remember that Caldor fire in California from late this summer? Well, now, 2 people have been accused of starting that fire that burned more than 200,000 acres of land. A father and a son will explain why officials say they believe they're to blame. And it's a safe space looking to help fight drug overdose deaths in this country. Jacob Soboroff takes us inside one of the nation's first overdose prevention centers. An exclusive look he's going to talk about in tonight's Backstory. Coming up, we're going to give you an exclusive look inside this place that creates a supervised space for drug users in the hopes of preventing overdose deaths. We're going to explain how it works, and then Jacob Soboroff will take us inside his reporting on the nation's first overdose center. This doesn't exist anywhere else in this country in just a minute. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our L.A. bureau, a father and son in California are getting blamed for that huge Caldor fire that burned something like 200,000 acres near Lake Tahoe over the summer. Remember that? These are the two. You just saw them on screen. David Scott Smith and Travis Shane Smith. They were arrested, charged with reckless arson. Their attorney says they didn't do it. Officials haven't really shared many details on what exactly the men are accused of having done, how they started it. In the meantime, they're being held on $1 million bail. From a Northeast bureau, Boston police say a driver is dead after a crash that nearly split a truck in half last night. It was in pieces on the side of the road. It reportedly hit a tree. Officials say the roads were really slick and really icy when the crash happened. And out of our Midwest bureau, a woman is lucky to be alive after her car crashed into a river in Illinois. That's what police are saying. So this is it. That's the car in the river. That's the ice. And the woman they rescued, she was 62 years old. It was about 25 feet away from the shore. It's tough to tell from this perspective. Well, there you go. You can see them. They were able to get her. She seems to be okay. She was taken to a hospital for evaluation because obviously that water is real cold. Time to get the backstory now. Our behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into our bigger picture. And tonight we're taking you inside one of the very first overdose prevention centers in the entire country. It's the first in the nation. And it's just like what it sounds like, right? This safe space where drug users can come for clean needles, where overdoses can be reversed, where users are also given options for treating addiction. For context, we said this is the first one in the country. It's not the first one in the world, right? You're looking at a map here. More than 100 overdose prevention centers exist in Canada, Australia, some European countries. You see the one on this map here that we're talking about in New York. 2 of them, Washington Heights and East Harlem. It took this long because there's so much debate about where and whether these centers should even exist in the first place. Remember, some of these drugs that we're talking about are illegal. Federal law technically says this is unlawful activity because you are not allowed to own or rent a place where illegal drugs are used. That's exactly what's happening here. But advocates see centers like this as literally life-saving, right? They're already pointing to lives being saved, even with this overdose center open just a few days now. And it's so important, they say, right now, because U.S. overdose deaths hit a high in the pandemic, up 30% in the past year. You've been looking at video from the exclusive access that NBC News was given to that East Harlem clinic with our Jacob Soboroff. He went inside, and while he was there, he talked with somebody who went to inject safely. Watch.
Because normally I'd be down the block sitting on the stoop, injecting myself in the arm, not caring who's walking by or driving by. Unless it's children, of course, then I'll do my best to disguise it.
Jacob Soboroff is joining us now. Jacob, we're so glad to have you for the backstory. Thank you. And as you know, it's when we get a chance to talk with reporters, incredible reporters like yourself, about what it was like to put this story together and what it was like for you to experience this, right? Because you're standing there, you're talking with this veteran, with this incredibly sort of intense expression and explanation of what he's going through at a super vulnerable moment for him. And there you are. How does that feel?
You used the word, Hallie. It was intense. And the first thing I just want to say is thank you to you and to your team, in particular to Brianna on your team, because this is something I know has been important to you. And you guys worked really hard to get the access into this facility in order to tell this story. It is American history. And it felt that way inside this facility. You laid it out perfectly. This is something that's been going on around the world for decades in dozens of countries, and no one has ever died inside of one of these facilities. But because of politics, because of controversy, because of trepidation, they've never opened one of these in the United States of America. And this is a huge experiment. It's a huge risk for them to let us into a facility like this. And as a human being, you know, the sort of philosophy of these places is you're going to meet people where they're at. If they're a drug user, you're not going to stigmatize them. You're not going to point a finger at them. You're going to allow them to come in and use, and then see where things go from there, so that they don't die, and to be allowed into someone's life at the most vulnerable moment like that is a really profound experience.
You talk about one of our incredible producers here, Brianna De Jesus Banyo, who worked with, I know, you and your team to get access. Can you pull back the curtain, right? Tell, like, how were you able to essentially convince them to say we should go in? Because as you say, this is such a vulnerable moment for people, right? You do have to, you know, meet them where they are. How do you convince the organizers here that you're the right person to go in and tell that story, that our team, you know, at NBC is the right people to tell that story?
Well, I think, I mean, you're showing some footage from in 2017. We went to a similar facility in Toronto, Canada, where they were doing this at a pop-up location. Actually, the footage on the screen right now is in New York City, where they wanted to do this in 2017, 4 years ago, and they weren't able to do it. And now that they are able to do it, now that the city has sanctioned it, saying, as a public health imperative, the government thinks this is the safest thing to do to stop people from dying, it was on us to talk to the people there at the facility that you're looking at right now to say, look, we get it. We're going to be sensitive. We're going to be compassionate. We understand that this is a vulnerable moment for people, and you will show us, we will show what happens at the most sensitive moments in these people's lives, including when an overdose happens, which actually happened while we were there. And this is some footage we haven't shown anywhere else. I would love to show it to you right now. Take a look at this. An overdose just happened just now.
Yes.
What generally happens in a situation like that?
Kind of depends what sort of overdose it is, and because it was just happening as we were going through the door, I don't have any details, but it would either have been an opiate-involved overdose,
like heroin or fentanyl?
That's right, yep. A polysubstance overdose, a stimulant overdose, something of that nature.
And the idea is you need to reverse the overdose as soon as it happens.
Absolutely. The great benefit of these sites is we're there at the immediate onset of symptoms, and we can intervene and resolve them very, very quickly.
So, it's about being able to understand and to have the perspective. And I think that they trusted us. They trusted Brianna. They trusted your team. They trusted NBC News because we have a track record of approaching this, not sensationally, but sensitively. And even though it's controversial, we're telling the story for people to make up their own minds.
So you walk into this, well researched, well read, with experience having covered this. I wonder if there was anything, Jacob, in the course of you reporting this out that surprised you, that you weren't expecting to see.
It's so clinical in there. I mean, it almost feels like a doctor's office. And I had seen this site in Toronto in 2017, which I think gave us really important perspective coming into this, that so often we look at things through the lens of the United States and why we do or don't do things. But we were really behind in approaching this. And I think going inside and actually seeing something in the U.S. that I had seen 4 years earlier in Canada and people have been experiencing around the country, it was actually a really moving moment to see that the United States is now trying something, even though it's controversial, in order to try to help people survive in the deadliest overdose crisis in American history.
You say it was clinical, Jacob? Is that because of the sort of setting?
I think so. I mean, you look around and it almost looks like actually a beauty parlor. There's different stalls, Hallie, and it's like you're looking at the mirrors and people are sitting in the chairs. And the only reason they had those dividers up, I believe, is for the privacy of people because we were in there. But you could see, that was the other thing. That gentleman, Oz, the Marine Corps veteran, you asked me what surprised me. He wanted to talk. He wanted to tell us why he's there, why this is important to him, and why other people should treat him as a human being and not as an addict or not as a criminal for using what, let's be frank, are illegal drugs.
Jacob Soboroff, it's great reporting. We really, really appreciate you bringing this story to light. We're excited to see more of it on NBC Nightly News. Jacob Soboroff, thank you.
Thanks, Hallie.
Coming up here on the show. Got a light? If you're under a certain age in New Zealand, you won't, because the country is announcing plans to ban younger people from ever being able to buy cigarettes, a lifetime ban. We'll talk about how health officials are reacting to this new crackdown. This is an interesting one. We're talking about it after the break. So let's say you are watching us from New Zealand and you are 14 years old. You are never going to be able to legally buy cigarettes where you live. It's because of this pretty innovative, groundbreaking, really new law that New Zealand announced today, where the minimum age to buy cigarettes would go up every year, right? It's like a forever law, meaning you never age into the law. You're always, like if you're on the older side, you're always a year out, basically. If we do the math, it means that 65 years after this law goes into place, so 65 years from now, you could only legally buy cigarettes if you were in your 80s. So what does this mean? The master plan is to eventually eliminate smoking. If it's illegal for everybody, the idea is everybody ages out of it. These new policies still allow vaping, which is obviously more and more popular with young people. One study found that more than a quarter of New Zealand teens were vaping on the reg. Dr. Natalie Azar is here with more. Natalie, this is super interesting, right? New Zealand already makes it very expensive to smoke. A pack of cigarettes costs like $24 US, compared to $6 a pack roughly here. How do you see this from a medical perspective, right?
Right. When I was listening to you describe it, I was thinking to myself, this is never going to work, Like, how could you possibly have, make it illegal to smoke cigarettes for everybody? But yeah, I mean, their approach is basically to make it unaffordable and inaccessible. And it doesn't happen overnight, right? They say by 2024, they want to decrease the number of sellers who are authorized to sell cigarettes. By 2025, they want to lower the amount of nicotine in the cigarettes. And, the proponents say that lower nicotine, eventually leads to people quitting. And then, people who are against this say, people who are lower income are just going to have to buy more cigarettes because of the nicotine content. And as you point out, they're not touching vaping. And, the big concern here is that vaping, because it still contains nicotine, which is the addictive substance, is kind of like the gateway, especially for younger people. So, it'll be interesting to see what happens. What I would say is that from a public health perspective, I think it has its merits, and I definitely think it has things that are not going to work in this approach.
And I wonder if one of those things is not the idea that, like, would this not just create maybe a black market for cigarettes, right? That's been one of the criticisms here. Does something like this work in public health when it's just like a ban, you can't do it, we're going to, you can't do it legally?
Exactly. Well, let me just give you some other examples from public health interventions that didn't work. For example, the soda tax. Okay, that was supposed to eliminate obesity in this country. It certainly didn't do that. Think about smoking. In 1984, they raised or drinking, I should say, they raised the age from 18 to 21. Right. And over the next 10 years, they did see a decrease in the number of fatal crashes in younger drivers, but underage drinking certainly did not decrease. It's almost like that, that forbidden fruit. From a public health perspective, what helps to help people quit is setting very, very smart goals that are attainable, that are measurable, eliminating roadblocks, tracking people's behavior. I'm not saying it's not worth trying. I think that there's some merit to it. I think it's really like that. It just sounds like a big nut to crack.
Dr. Natalie Azar, I hear you. Thank you so much. I appreciate your public health perspective, as always. That does it for us this hour. More Hallie Jackson now here for you tomorrow. Same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.